The rain fell on the city with the grim determination of a debt collector. It slicked the asphalt of the alley behind Lou's diner until it shone like bruised skin under the single, sputtering sodium lamp. Ilara felt the damp chill of it seep through the thin fabric of her uniform as she heaved another black bag into the dumpster, the reek of sour milk and old grease clinging to the air. This was the end of her Tuesday. It was the end of every day. A litany of aching feet, the ghost of 1,000 coffee orders echoing in her ears, and this final, solitary ritual in the rain-soaked dark. For 3 weeks now, the darkness had felt different. It was no longer a simple absence of light, but a presence. It had weight and texture, and it watched her. At first, she'd dismissed it as exhaustion, the city's perpetual paranoia seeping into her bones. But the feeling had sharpened, coalesced. It was the same sedan, a shade of black so deep it seemed to drink the streetlights, parked a block down from her apartment every night. It was the customer 2 days ago who'd left no tip, only a single, perfect, dead raven's feather on the table, its obsidian sheen a silent threat. It was the way the alley, once just an unpleasant shortcut, now felt like a throat, ready to close around her. She slammed the dumpster lid shut, the clang of metal a pathetic protest against the oppressive quiet. Her heart hammered a frantic, unsteady rhythm against her ribs, a trapped bird fluttering in a cage of bone. She pulled her worn cardigan tighter, a useless shield against the cold and the fear. The walk home was 6 blocks. 6 blocks of looking over her shoulder, of seeing menace in every shadow pooled in a doorway, of mistaking the rustle of a newspaper for footsteps behind her. Tonight, the watching felt closer. The air was thick with it, a pressure against her skin. She could feel eyes on her back, a gaze as tangible as a touch. She didn't dare turn around. Not yet. She fumbled in her pocket for her keys, the metal cold and sharp against her numb fingers. Just get to the street. To the light. The thought was a desperate prayer. 1 foot in front of the other. The squelch of her worn sneakers on the wet pavement was too loud, a broadcast of her location, her vulnerability. A sound cut through the drone of the rain. A soft scrape. Not a rat. Not the wind. It was the sound of a leather sole shifting on gravel. It came from the mouth of the alley, blocking her way out. Ilara froze. Her breath caught, a painful knot in her chest. Every horror story, every whispered warning from the other waitresses, every headline about women who walked home alone at night crashed down on her in a single, paralyzing wave. This is it. This is how it ends. The thought was strangely calm, a tiny, cold stone of certainty in the swirling chaos of her fear. She forced herself to turn, a slow, mechanical pivot. 2 figures stood there, silhouetted against the distant glow of the street. They were large men, broad-shouldered and utterly still, their featureless shapes made monstrous by the dim light. They didn't speak. They didn't have to. Their stillness was a statement of intent, a promise of violence. "Please," she whispered, the word a pathetic puff of vapor in the cold air. "I don't have any money." One of them took a step forward, and the light caught the glint of something in his hand. Not a gun. Something uglier, more intimate. A knife. The blade was long and thin, and it seemed to hunger for the meager light. Ilara's mind went white with terror. There was nowhere to run. The dumpster at her back, a brick wall to her left, another to her right. It was a cage. They had her in a cage. Her legs trembled, threatening to give out. She could smell their cologne now, something cheap and cloying that couldn't mask the scent of stale cigarette smoke. The second man laughed, a low, guttural sound that scraped against her nerves. "We don't want your money, sweetheart." He took another step, and Ilara squeezed her eyes shut, a primal, childish instinct to make it all go away. She braced for the impact, for the pain, for the end. But it didn't come. Instead, a new silence fell over the alley. A silence so profound, so absolute, that it swallowed the sound of the rain, the hum of the city, even the frantic beat of her own heart. It was a dead, velvet quiet, heavier and more terrifying than the men had been. Ilara opened her eyes. The 2 men were no longer looking at her. They were staring past her, into the deepest shadows by the dumpster. Their smug confidence had vanished, replaced by a raw, animal fear that contorted their faces into masks of disbelief. The man with the knife had gone rigid, his knuckles white. And then she saw him. He hadn't been there a second ago. She was sure of it. He seemed to have materialized from the darkness itself, a figure carved from night and stillness. He was tall and impossibly elegant in a dark, tailored coat that seemed to absorb the gloom around him. His face was pale, a stark canvas of aristocratic bones and shadows, his hair the color of ink. He was utterly motionless, and yet he filled the alley with an aura of ancient, predatory power that made the two thugs look like frightened children. He took a single, silent step forward. The movement was fluid, boneless, the grace of a panther. "She is not for you," he said. His voice was not loud, but it resonated in the enclosed space, a low, cultured timbre that vibrated in Alara's very bones. It was a voice accustomed to absolute, unquestioning obedience. The man with the knife found a sliver of bravado. "Who the hell are you?" he snarled, trying to reclaim his dominance. The stranger's lips curved into a smile that held no warmth, no humor. It was a chilling display of white teeth, the canines just a fraction too long, too sharp. "I am the reason you will leave this alley now," he said, his voice dropping to a silken whisper that was more menacing than any shout. "And you will forget you ever saw her. You will forget her face, her name, the scent of her fear. You will go on with your meaningless lives and you will never, ever trouble her again. Do you understand?" It wasn't a question. It was an enchantment, a command woven into the very fabric of the air. Alara felt the strange, compelling power of it herself, a dizzying pull. The two men stood mesmerized, their eyes wide and vacant. The knife clattered from the first man's nerveless fingers, skittering across the wet ground. "We understand," they droned in unison, their voices flat and lifeless. "Go," the stranger commanded. Without another word, they turned and walked away, their movements stiff and puppet-like. They disappeared around the corner, swallowed by the city, leaving behind only the forgotten knife and the profound, ringing silence. Alara stared at the empty space where they had been, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. Her legs finally gave way, and she sagged against the cold, wet brick of the wall, sliding down to sit on the damp pavement, heedless of the grime. She was shaking uncontrollably, a storm of delayed shock and terror shuddering through her. The stranger was still there. He hadn't moved. He was watching her, his gaze dark and unreadable. She couldn't see his eyes clearly in the shadows, but she could feel their weight, their intensity. He was the source of the silence, the epicenter of the unnatural calm that had descended upon the alley. He was more terrifying than the men with the knife had ever been. He took another step toward her, his expensive leather shoes making no sound on the broken concrete. He stopped a few feet away, a looming column of darkness. "Are you harmed?" he asked. The cultured voice was softer now, but it still held that unnerving resonance. Alara shook her head, unable to form words. Her throat was tight, her tongue a useless weight in her mouth. She could only stare up at him, at the pale, perfect face that seemed to belong to another century, another world. "They have been following you for 23 days, he stated, not as a question, but as a fact. "I had hoped they would lose interest. It seems I miscalculated." He knew. He had been watching, too. The realization sent a fresh wave of fear through her, colder and sharper than before. Who was he? What did he want? He seemed to read the questions in her eyes. He extended a hand to her. It was a long-fingered, graceful hand, the skin looking as smooth and pale as marble in the gloom. "My name is Caspian," he said. "And I would like to offer you my protection." Alara stared at his outstretched hand. It was a lifeline, an offer of safety in a world that had suddenly become filled with monsters. But she knew, with a certainty that went deeper than reason, that this man, this beautiful, terrifying savior, was the most dangerous creature in the alley tonight. And accepting his help would come with a price. He did not take her back to the diner, or to her small, third-floor apartment with its peeling paint and rattling windows. Instead, his car, the same impossibly black sedan that had haunted the periphery of her vision for weeks, materialized from the curb as if summoned. It was silent, gliding through the rain-slicked streets with an eerie smoothness. The interior was a world away from Alara's life, the scent of old leather and something else, something clean and cold like winter air, filled the small space. There was no music, only the rhythmic sweep of the windshield wipers and the soft hum of the engine. Caspian drove with an economy of motion, his hands resting lightly on the wheel. He did not speak, and the silence stretched, growing heavier with each passing block. Ilara sat pressed against the passenger door, as far from him as she could get, her hands clenched in her lap. She watched the city lights smear past the rain-beaded window, a river of fractured color. The familiar landscape of her neighborhood gave way to older, grander avenues lined with stone-faced townhouses and ancient, sleeping trees. They were moving into a part of the city she had only ever seen on postcards, a place of quiet wealth and shadowed history. He finally pulled the car to a stop before a wrought-iron gate set into a high stone wall. The gate swung inward without a sound, and they proceeded up a short, winding drive to a house that was less a house and more a small, Gothic cathedral. It rose into the night, all sharp angles and darkened stone, its windows like vacant eyes. Ivy clung to its walls, thick and black in the darkness. It was a place that had been standing for centuries, a monument of secrets and silence. "Where are we?" Ilara asked, her voice a thin thread of sound. "A place where you will be safe," Caspian replied, his gaze fixed on the imposing facade. He cut the engine, and the ensuing silence was absolute. The house seemed to swallow all sound. He led her inside. The door was massive, carved from a dark, heavy wood, and it opened into a foyer that was vast and cold. A grand staircase swept upward into darkness. The air was still and cool, carrying the scent of dust and beeswax and something else, the faint, metallic tang of old blood, so subtle she thought she might be imagining it. There were no lights on, but the space was not entirely dark. A pale, silvery luminescence seemed to emanate from the marble floors and the stone walls, an internal glow that provided just enough light to see the cavernous emptiness of the place. He led her not up the grand staircase but through an arched doorway into a library. Here, a fire was burning in a hearth large enough to stand in. The flames cast a warm, dancing light over shelves that stretched from floor to ceiling, crammed with thousands of leather-bound books. 2 high-backed armchairs faced the fire, and a small, low table stood between them. The room was the only welcoming space she had seen, yet it still felt achingly lonely, a pocket of warmth in an ocean of cold silence. "Please, sit," he said, gesturing to one of the chairs. He moved to a sideboard and poured a dark liquid into 2 crystal glasses. He brought one to her. It was wine, rich and red, the color of a deep bruise. Ilara took it, her hand trembling so badly the liquid shivered in the glass. She did not drink. Caspian took the seat opposite her, the firelight carving his face into a dramatic relief of light and shadow. He looked impossibly old and impossibly weary. The mask of command had slipped, just for a moment, and she saw something in his dark eyes that she recognized, a profound, bottomless loneliness. "Those men," he began, his voice low and measured, "are merely symptoms of a larger problem. They were hired. The one who hired them will not stop." "Who? Why?" The questions burst from her, desperate and raw. "I don't have anything. I'm no one inch." "You are not no one," he corrected her gently. "And that is precisely the problem. You were seen. By the wrong people. Seen being kind to someone you should not have been." He paused, letting the words sink in. "There was an old man, a beggar. You gave your leftovers to every night for a month. You brought him a blanket when the weather turned." Ilara stared at him, her mind reeling. She remembered the old man, his rheumy eyes and grateful, toothless smile. He had vanished a few weeks ago. She'd assumed he'd moved on. "He was not what he seemed," Caspian continued. "He was a fugitive. An enemy of a rival of mine. Your kindness was interpreted as alliance. A message was being sent, to me, through you. They intended to make an example of you." The casual cruelty of it stole her breath. Her small, simple act of kindness had marked her for death. The world suddenly felt thin and brittle, a place where hidden wars were fought in the shadows, and insignificant people like her were caught in the crossfire. "So, the protection," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "You're offering to protect me from your enemies." "I am," he confirmed. His gaze was direct, unwavering. "You can stay here. No one will reach you. No one will harm you. You will have food, comfort, safety. I will deal with the ones who hunt you. I will erase their interest in you completely. I give you my word." The promise was immense, a shield held up against a world of horrors she was only just beginning to comprehend. She looked around the vast, silent library, at the man who commanded such power with a quiet word. Safety. It was all she had wanted for weeks. But she knew it came at a cost. She had to ask. "What do you want in return?" she asked, steeling herself. Her blood. Her life, bound to his in servitude. Her soul. In this house, in his presence, anything seemed possible. Caspian leaned forward, the firelight catching the strange, ancient sorrow in his eyes. He set his glass down on the table, the crystal making a soft, clear sound. The air crackled with anticipation. He looked at her, and for the first time, she felt truly seen by him, not as a pawn or a victim, but as herself. "I do not want your blood," he said softly, as if hearing her thoughts. "I have no need of it. I do not want your servitude. I have 1,000 who serve me out of fear. And I have no interest in your soul." He paused, and the silence stretched, thick and heavy. "I want your memories," he said. Ilara stared at him, uncomprehending. "My memories?" She thought of magical, invasive procedures, of her mind being plundered, her past stolen from her. He seemed to understand her fear and shook his head slightly. "No, not in the way you are thinking. I will not take them from you. I want you to give them to me. Willingly." He leaned back in his chair, his long fingers steepling before him. "I have lived for a very long time, Ilara. I have seen empires rise and crumble to dust. I have seen stars shift in the sky. The grand sweep of history is as familiar to me as the back of my own hand. But I have forgotten the small things. The texture of a human life. The taste of a meal earned with a long day's work. The specific warmth of the sun on your face on a spring afternoon. The simple, profound pain of a scraped knee in childhood. The flickering hope of a first crush. These moments, they have eroded from me over the centuries, like soft stone under a relentless tide." His voice was a low murmur, filled with a melancholy so vast it seemed to be a part of the house itself, ingrained in its very stones. "My price is this," he said, his eyes locking with hers. "Every night, you will sit here with me, by this fire. And you will tell me a story from your life. One memory. It does not have to be grand or important. In fact, I would prefer it if it were not. Tell me about the color of the dress you wore to your 5th birthday party. Tell me about the first time you swam in the ocean and the shock of the cold water. Tell me about the smell of your grandmother's kitchen. Share with me the small, fleeting, beautifully insignificant moments that make up a life." He took a slow breath. "In exchange for your safety, I ask only for a window into a world I have lost." Ilara was speechless. Of all the grim prices she had imagined, this was not one of them. It was so strange, so intimate, so deeply personal. He wasn't asking for a pound of flesh, but for a piece of her spirit, offered up in words. He was a king of shadows, a creature of immense power, and what he craved was the mundane currency of a waitress's life. He was starving, she realized, but not for blood. He was starving for meaning. She looked from his lonely, ancient face to the fire, its light a symbol of the very warmth and life he seemed to have lost. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach. But beneath it, something else was stirring. A strange, unexpected flicker of empathy. A sense of shared solitude. In this grand, cold house, faced with this ancient, lonely creature, she felt a bizarre kinship. She, too, was alone. Her memories were all she truly had. "One story," she said, testing the words. "Every night." "One story," he confirmed. "That is the price." She thought of the alley, of the glint of the knife, of the certainty of her own death. She thought of the long, fearful walk home that awaited her if she refused. Then she looked at Caspian, at the king who ruled the darkness, who commanded men with a whisper, and who wanted nothing more than to hear about the time she fell off her bicycle. She picked up the wine glass, her hand suddenly steady. She took a small sip. It was rich and earthy, tasting of dark fruit and old soil. It warmed her from the inside out. "All right," she said, her voice clear and firm in the quiet of the great library. I accept. The first night was an exercise in profound and excruciating awkwardness. After her acceptance, Caspian had shown her to a suite of rooms, really, that was larger than her entire apartment. It was furnished with heavy, dark wood furniture, a canopied bed draped in velvet the color of a midnight sky, and a private bathroom with a clawfoot tub so large she could have floated in it. There was a wardrobe filled with clothes, simple but elegant dresses, soft sweaters, and comfortable trousers, all in her size. It was a gilded cage, beautiful and terrifying in its silent perfection. She had spent hours there, pacing the plush Aubusson carpet, touching the cool, smooth surfaces of the furniture, staring out the leaded glass window at a garden cloaked in shadow. She felt like a ghost, an imposter in a life that was not her own. The silence of the house pressed in on her, a physical weight. There were no servants, no staff, no other signs of life. Just her and him. When a soft knock came at her door precisely at 10:00 o'clock, her heart leaped into her throat. It was him. It was time to pay the first installment. She followed him back to the library. The fire had been stoked, casting the same warm, hypnotic glow. He had not changed his clothes, still immaculate in the dark trousers and silk shirt he wore beneath his coat. He gestured again to the armchair, and she sat, perching on the edge of the cushion, her spine ramrod straight. He took his own seat, a glass of the same red wine in his hand, and waited. He just waited. He didn't prompt her or question her. He simply settled into his chair, his posture relaxed but his attention absolute, and fixed his dark, patient gaze on her. The silence stretched. The only sounds were the crackle and hiss of the fire and the frantic thumping of her own blood in her ears. What was she supposed to say? Her life, when held up to the scrutiny of this ancient, powerful being, seemed pathetic and dull. A collection of insignificant moments. How could she choose one? What could possibly be of interest to a man who had seen empires fall? Her mind was a frantic, blank slate. She thought of her childhood, a blur of beige apartments and moving boxes. She thought of her teenage years, awkward and lonely. She thought of the last few years, a monotonous cycle of work and sleep. There were no grand adventures, no epic romances, no moments of profound revelation. I don't know what to tell you, she stammered, her voice small in the vast room. Caspian's expression didn't change. Start anywhere, he said, his voice a calm, low rumble. The first thing that comes to mind. There is no right or wrong memory, Elara. The first thing. Her mind, desperate, snagged on an image. Faded floral wallpaper. The smell of cinnamon and yeast. A small, warm hand in hers. My grandmother, she began, the words coming out in a hesitant rush. She used to bake bread. Every Sunday morning. I must have been 6 or 7. I would stay with her on weekends sometimes. Her house was very small, but it was always warm. And it always smelled safe. She paused, testing the memory, turning it over. Caspian remained silent, his attention a tangible force, encouraging her to continue. She would wake me up before the sun rose. She'd say the dough needed to be woken up gently, just like little girls. Her kitchen had this yellow linoleum floor, cracked in places, and the wallpaper had these little pink flowers on it. I remember tracing them with my finger while I waited. She could see it so clearly, feel the cool, smooth surface of the wallpaper under her fingertip. She'd let me help. She'd give me my own little piece of dough. My hands were too small and clumsy to knead properly, but she never said so. She just showed me how to fold it, over and over. Her hands were covered in flour, her knuckles were swollen with arthritis, but they were so strong. The dough was alive. It was warm and soft and it would push back against my fingers. She looked at her own hands, resting in her lap. They were Waitress's hands, chapped and calloused, nails cut short. She could almost feel the phantom sensation of that warm, living dough. The best part was when it was baking. The whole house would fill up with this incredible smell. It was the warmest, most comforting smell in the world. We would sit at her little kitchen table and wait. And when it came out of the oven, she would cut the first slice for me. The heel. She'd spread it with butter, so much butter that it would melt right away and drip down my chin. And we would eat it, right there, in the quiet of the morning, with the sun just starting to come through the window. She fell silent. The memory was complete. It felt fragile, holding it out in the open like this. She risked a glance at Caspian. He was watching her, but his gaze was distant, unfocused. His eyes, which had seemed so dark and impenetrable before, held a strange, softened quality. He looked as if he were listening to a faint, faraway piece of music. He was not in the library anymore. He was in a small, warm kitchen with yellow floors, smelling the scent of baking bread. He blinked slowly, returning to himself. A long moment passed. "Flower," he said, his voice quiet, almost reverent. "I remember the feeling. Like fine, soft dust. It would get into the creases of your clothes. The smell of the yeast, a living thing." He looked at his own pale, elegant hands as if seeing them for the first time in a century. "Thank you, Ilara." The gratitude in his voice was so genuine, so profound, it startled her. For that small, simple story. It was as if she had given him a priceless gift. The tension in her shoulders eased, just a fraction. This was her currency now. Her past. And apparently, it had value. The next night, she told him about learning to ride a bicycle. She described the rusty, second-hand bike, its peeling blue paint, the wobbly training wheels. She recounted the frustration, the scraped knees, the dozens of failed attempts. And then, the one miraculous moment when her father let go and she was flying, wobbling for 3, then 4, then 10 feet, the wind in her hair, her heart soaring with a feeling of pure, unadulterated freedom. Caspian listened with the same rapt attention. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time before he spoke. Freedom, he mused, his voice soft. To be so untethered. To feel the world rush past you, powered only by your own small body. A curious sensation. He looked out the tall library window into the unending night. A very curious sensation indeed. And so it went. Night after night. A strange, solemn ritual in the heart of the silent, Gothic mansion. She told him about the stray cat she'd fed for a winter, the one she'd named Patches. She told him about her first day of school, the paralyzing fear and the small kindness of a teacher who gave her a special star-shaped sticker. She told him about the time she and her best friend, Sarah, had built a terrible, lopsided fort out of blankets and chairs in her living room, and hidden inside with a flashlight, telling ghost stories until they scared themselves into giggles. With each story, she gave him a piece of herself. And with each story, the space between their armchairs seemed to shrink. The fear she felt in his presence began to recede, replaced by a cautious curiosity. He was no longer just a terrifying, monolithic creature of the night. He was Caspian. He was the one who listened. He was the one who remembered the smell of yeast and pondered the freedom of a wobbly bicycle. He rarely spoke of himself. Her stories were the focus. But sometimes, a memory of hers would trigger a fragment of his own, a brief, startling glimpse into his impossibly long existence. Her story of the ocean prompted him to murmur, "I saw it once when it was truly wild. Before the great ships. When men feared it as a god." Her description of a starry night sky from a camping trip made him say, "The constellations have shifted. I knew them when they were young." These glimpses were fleeting, but they built a picture of a being adrift in time, a lonely observer watching the world change around him, while he remained the same. The price he was asking of her began to make a terrible, poignant sense. He was not just collecting memories, he was trying to anchor himself. He was using her small, fleeting, human life to remember what it felt like to be alive. And Ilara, the waitress from Lou's diner, had become the unlikely keeper of a vampire king's lost humanity. The days fell into a rhythm as strange and hypnotic as a ticking clock in an empty house. Ilara would wake late, to find a tray of food left silently outside her door, fresh fruit, warm bread, cheeses, things she couldn't name but which tasted of sunlight and earth. She would spend her days exploring the vast, silent manor. It was a labyrinth of forgotten rooms, halls lined with portraits of people with Caspian's pale skin and dark, solemn eyes, their clothes shifting through the centuries. She found a ballroom where dust motes danced in thin shafts of light, a music room with a grand piano whose keys were yellowed like old teeth, and a conservatory where strange, colorless flowers grew in the perpetual twilight, their petals like sculpted wax. The house was a museum of his loneliness, and she was its sole living occupant. The initial fear of her gilded cage began to transform into a kind of peaceful solitude. She was safe. For the first time in years, she wasn't exhausted. She wasn't worried about rent or creepy customers or the walk home in the dark. The constant, low-level anxiety that had been her companion for so long had finally quieted. All that was asked of her was to remember. The nights remained the anchor of her new existence. Their ritual in the library became less of a transaction and more of a communion. The awkwardness of the first few sessions had melted away, replaced by a comfortable, familiar silence that settled between them before she began to speak. She no longer had to search for memories, they came to her easily now, rising to the surface like bubbles in a clear spring. She told him about the bitter disappointment of a snow day that never came, the feeling of waiting by the window, watching for flakes, only to be met with a cold, grey rain. She described the singular, childish injustice of it with such clarity that Caspian gave a small, sad smile. "Hope," he'd said quietly. "It is a uniquely painful thing to lose." She told him about her first job, at a bookstore, and the papery, vanilla scent of old books that she loved. She described the joy of recommending a favorite novel to a stranger and seeing their eyes light up. This memory made him thoughtful. He rose from his chair and walked to one of the towering shelves, pulling down a slim, leather-bound volume. It was a book of poetry, the text handwritten in elegant, archaic script. "This was a gift," he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "From the man who wrote it. A friend. He was mortal." The way he said the word mortal was filled with a universe of loss. He did not elaborate, but Ilara understood. Every friend he had ever made, every connection, had turned to dust while he remained. Her stories grew more personal, the memories more vulnerable. She spoke of her parents' divorce, not the loud fights, but the quiet, sad aftermath, the feeling of being split in two, of having two bedrooms but no single home. She spoke of the hollow ache of it, a wound that had never quite healed. That night, after she finished, the silence in the room was different. It was heavier, filled with an unspoken empathy. Caspian didn't offer a philosophical musing or a historical parallel. He simply watched her, his dark eyes filled with a profound and startling tenderness. He rose, and for a terrifying moment, she thought he was going to touch her. Instead, he went to the fire and nudged a log with an iron poker, sending a shower of bright, golden sparks up the chimney. It was a simple, domestic gesture, but it felt like a shield, a way of containing an emotion too large for the space between them. "The breaking of a bond," he said, his back to her. "It leaves a phantom limb. An ache where something used to be." He turned back, and the sorrow in his face was no longer just ancient and weary, it was personal, immediate. "I know the feeling." It was the most he had ever revealed of himself, a crack in the marble facade. She felt a sudden, fierce urge to know more, to ask about the bonds he had lost, the phantom aches he carried. But the moment was too fragile. She didn't dare. Their strange intimacy was a bubble, a world contained within the stone walls of the manor. But the world outside had not disappeared. One evening, as she was telling him a story about a disastrous attempt to bake a birthday cake for her mother, a story meant to be funny, about clouds of flour and a lopsided, burnt offering, Caspian suddenly went still. His head tilted, his eyes losing focus as he listened to something she couldn't hear. The air in the room grew cold, the comfortable warmth of the fire suddenly unable to penetrate the chill that emanated from him. "What is it?" she asked, her story dying on her lips. His focus snapped back to her, but the softness was gone. His eyes were sharp, hard points of obsidian. The king was back. "There is a guest," he said, and the word guest sounded like a curse. "Stay here. Do not leave this room." He stood and swept from the library, his movements swift and silent, a wraith of purpose and contained fury. Ilara was left alone with the fire, her heart hammering against her ribs. The safety of her sanctuary had been breached. The bubble had burst. She heard the voices then, faint but clear, from the grand foyer. Caspian's low, controlled tone, and another voice, this one laced with a contemptuous, aristocratic drawl. It was male, and it dripped with arrogance. She couldn't make out the words, But the tone was unmistakable, a challenge. Disobeying his command, she crept to the library door, cracking it open just enough to see. Across the vast, shadowed expanse of the foyer, near the main entrance, stood Caspian. Facing him was another man, almost as tall, with pale blonde hair that shone like spun silver in the gloom. He was dressed in opulent, old-fashioned finery, a stark contrast to Caspian's modern, understated elegance. His face was a mask of cruel, handsome beauty. "Hiding in your fortress, old friend," the blonde man sneered. "And with a new pet, I hear. How domestic." "My affairs are not your concern, Valerus." Caspian's voice was dangerously calm, a quiet rumble that promised violence. "You are not welcome in this house. You know this." "Oh, but I am so very welcome elsewhere," Valerus replied, his smile widening. "Your rivals send their regards. They are so very interested in your newfound hobby. This touching attachment to immortal. They see it as a weakness, a distraction, an opportunity." He took a deliberate step forward. "They wonder how far you would go to protect your little stray. They have hired new men, more competent than the last. They are very eager to find out." The threat was naked, brutal. Valerus was not just a rival, he was a messenger. The forces that had hired the thugs in the alley were still out there, and now they knew Caspian was protecting her. She was not just a pawn anymore, she was the chink in the king's armor. "Leave, Valerus," Caspian said, each word a chip of ice. "Now, before I forget the centuries of our acquaintance and remove you from my house in pieces." Valerus laughed, a sharp, unpleasant sound that echoed in the cavernous space. "So fierce. All for a creature with the lifespan of a gnat. You have grown soft, Caspian. This city will eat you alive." He gave a mocking bow, turned with a dramatic flourish, and was gone, the great door closing behind him with a deep, final boom. Caspian stood alone in the foyer for a long time, his back to the library. His shoulders were rigid, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The predatory stillness was back, but this time it was coiled tight with a fury that seemed to make the very air around him vibrate. When he finally turned, his eyes met hers through the crack in the door. The mask was gone. In his gaze, she saw not just anger, but a raw, desperate fear. It was not a fear for himself. It was for her. The price of her safety had just gone up, and she knew, with a sickening certainty, that it was a price he was terrified he might not be able to pay. The visit from Valerus shattered the peace of the manor. The silence that had once felt contemplative now felt charged with menace. Every shadow seemed deeper, every creak of the old house a potential threat. Ilara found herself starting at noises that weren't there, her brief respite from anxiety erased in a single, chilling conversation. She was no longer just a refugee, she was the battlefield upon which a hidden war was being fought. Caspian became a ghost. He was absent during the days, and Ilara knew he was out in the city, moving through the shadowed corridors of his power, hunting the threats Valerus had promised. When he returned, long after sunset, he carried the night with him, a weariness that went bone deep and a cold, grim focus that kept him distant. Yet, he never missed their nightly ritual. If anything, he seemed to cling to it, a piece of mooring in a storm-tossed sea. He would arrive in the library, shed the violence of the outside world like a heavy coat, and settle into his chair, his eyes closing for a moment as if in prayer. And then he would look at her, and the command was unspoken but clear: "Tell me a story. Remind me." So she did. She dug deeper, past the simple, sunlit memories of childhood. She gave him the pieces of herself that were harder to voice, the memories that carried scars. She told him about the first time she'd had her heart broken, the crushing, physical weight of it, the feeling that she would never be whole again. She described crying in her bedroom, listening to a sad song on repeat, feeling the exquisite, self-indulgent misery of a teenage girl who believes her world has ended. Caspian listened, his expression unreadable, until she was finished. The fire crackled, filling the silence. "We do not heal," he said, his voice a low murmur. "Not entirely. The wound closes, but the tissue is different. Thicker. Less sensitive." He touched his own chest, a fleeting, unconscious gesture over his heart. "We learn to carry the scar." It was a confession. An admission of his own unhealed wounds. In that moment, the immense gulf of age and experience between them vanished, and they were simply two beings who understood what it meant to be broken. Another night, seeking to push past the gloom that had settled over them, she told him about a moment of pure, unadulterated joy. A music festival she'd gone to with friends years ago. She described the press of the crowd, the ground vibrating with the bass, the feeling of thousands of people singing the same lyrics, their voices rising together as one. She spoke of the euphoria of it, the loss of self in a shared, ecstatic moment, dancing under the open sky until she was breathless and exhausted and happier than she had ever been. When she finished, a faint, wistful smile touched Caspian's lips. To be one of many, he mused. To surrender your solitude, even for a moment. That is a kind of magic I have never known. A king is always one. Alone. The word hung in the air between them. Alone. It was the truth of him, the core of his being. He was a creature of singular power and singular loneliness. And she, in her small human way, was the only one who had ever been invited to stand on the shore of that vast, solitary ocean and not be swept away. One night, she found him in the library before their appointed time. He was not in his chair, but standing before the tall window, staring out at the rain that lashed against the glass. He didn't seem to notice her arrival. He looked lost. The weight of his centuries seemed to be pressing down on him, bending his proud shoulders. She felt a surge of courage, a need to breach the wall he kept so carefully constructed. "Tell me one," she said softly. He turned, startled, his eyes dark and questioning. "A memory," she clarified, moving to stand a few feet away from him. "Your turn." He looked taken aback, as though the very concept was foreign. The contract was for her memories, not his. But she held his gaze, her expression gentle but insistent. It was no longer a contract. It was a connection, and it had to go both ways. He was silent for a long time, his gaze turned inward, searching through the vast, dusty archives of his mind. "They are not like yours," he warned, his voice rough. "They are gray with time. The colors have faded." "It doesn't matter," she said. He turned back to the window, watching the rivulets of water trace paths down the pane. "There was a garden," he began, his voice distant. "In a place that no longer exists. The name is gone, the city is dust. But I remember the garden. I was very young. Not yet what I am now. I was a boy." The word was a shock. To think of him as a boy, with scraped knees and a child's wonder, seemed impossible. "My mother," he continued, "she loved the roses. There was a particular kind, a deep, velvety crimson. She called them heart's blood. She would spend hours in that garden. I would sit on a stone bench and watch her. She taught me their names. She taught me how to prune them, how to be gentle with the thorns." He fell silent, lost in the image. Ilara could almost see it, a boy with dark hair and serious eyes, watching a woman whose face was lost to time, her hands moving expertly among blood-red roses. One day, a sickness came to the city. It moved swiftly. My mother, she grew weak. I would bring her a rose from the garden every morning. I thought, as a child thinks, that the flower's strength could be given to her. That its life would sustain hers. His voice broke, just for a fraction of a second, a hairline fracture in his composure. "The last one I brought her, she was too weak to hold. It fell from her fingers onto the white sheets. A single drop of crimson on a field of snow." He stopped. He did not need to say the rest. Ilara felt a profound, aching sorrow for the little boy who had tried to bargain with death, using roses as his currency. She saw the origin of the man before her, the first and deepest scar from which all the others grew. This was his phantom limb. This was the wound that had never healed. She did something then that she never would have dared before. She closed the distance between them and laid a hand gently on his arm. His muscles went rigid beneath her touch, his entire body freezing at the contact. He was as cold as the marble statues in the hall. For a moment, she thought he would pull away, that she had crossed an unforgivable line. But he didn't. He slowly, hesitantly, turned his hand over and covered hers. His fingers were long and cool, his touch surprisingly gentle. It was not a romantic gesture. It was something far more elemental. It was an acknowledgement. A shared moment of grief across an impossible chasm of time. They stood like that for a long time, in silence, two lonely souls watching the rain, his story a fragile, glittering thing in the space between them. The balance of their arrangement had shifted forever. She was no longer just paying a debt. She was healing a wound. The fragile peace born of that shared vulnerability was not destined to last. Valerus's threat had been a promise, and Caspian's enemies were patient. The attack came on a Tuesday, 6 weeks to the day since Alara had first entered the manor. It was just after midnight, the house wrapped in its usual profound quiet. The nightly ritual was over. Alara had told a simple, happy story about winning a spelling bee in the 3rd grade, a deliberate offering of light against the encroaching darkness. Caspian had seemed to draw strength from it, the grim lines around his mouth softening as he listened. She was in her room, preparing for bed, when a sound from below shattered the stillness. It wasn't loud. It was a soft, sharp crack, like a branch snapping in a frozen forest. It was followed by the faint, musical tinkle of shattering glass. Alara froze, her hand on the velvet drapery of her bed. The sound had come from the conservatory, the glass room at the back of the house. Every nerve in her body went on high alert. The house's silence was its armor, that sound was the first crack in its shell. Before she could even process the thought, her bedroom door burst open. Caspian stood there, but he was transformed. The weary scholar from the library was gone, replaced by a creature of pure, lethal intent. His eyes were black, bottomless pits of fury, and an aura of cold, ancient power rolled off him in waves. He was not wearing a coat or shoes, as if he'd been caught unawares, but it didn't matter. His very presence was a weapon. "They are here," he said, his voice a low, vicious snarl. He crossed the room in 2 silent strides, his movements impossibly fast. He grabbed her arm, his grip firm but not painful. "You must not make a sound." He pulled her from the room, not toward the grand staircase, but to a section of ornate wood paneling on the far wall. He pressed a specific point, and a section of the wall swung inward, revealing a narrow, dark passage. The air that wafted out was cold and smelled of stone and earth. "Go," he commanded, his eyes already scanning the hallway behind them. "Follow this passage. It leads down, to the old cellars. There is a tunnel. It will take you beyond the walls of the property. Do not stop. Do not look back." Alara stared at him, her heart pounding with a terror that was not just for herself, but for him. He was sending her away. He was going to face them alone. "No," she said, her voice trembling. "I won't leave you." A flicker of surprise, of something that might have been tenderness, crossed his face before it was replaced by a look of fierce command. "This is not a negotiation, Alara. Your safety was the bargain. I will not have it broken." He gave her a gentle push toward the opening. "Go. Now." From downstairs, a new sound arose, a man's shout of pain, cut off abruptly. Then another. They were inside. They were fighting. Caspian turned his head, his senses attuned to the battle below. "There are 4 of them," he growled, more to himself than to her. "Professionals." He looked back at her, his expression desperate. "Please, Alara. For me. Run." The plea in his voice, the raw vulnerability of it, broke her resolve. He was the king, the ancient power, but in that moment, he was terrified of losing her. She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. She stepped into the darkness of the passage. "Caspian," she whispered. He looked at her, his face a pale mask in the gloom. "The roses," she said, the words tumbling out. "Heart's blood." His eyes widened. For a heartbeat, he was not the warrior king, but the boy in the garden, his grief laid bare. It was a reminder of what he fought for, not power, not territory, but the preservation of a heart he had thought long dead. A harsh, guttural cry echoed up from the foyer. The fight was coming closer. The moment was broken. He slammed the secret panel shut, plunging her into absolute blackness. She heard the faint click of the lock, and then, on the other side of the wall, the sound of his impossibly fast footsteps as he ran toward the battle. Alara stood in the suffocating dark, her body trembling. He had told her to run. Every instinct screamed at her to obey, to flee into the tunnel and save herself. But the thought of him facing those men alone, of him falling to protect her, was unbearable. He had saved her life. He had listened to her stories. He had shown her the boy who loved roses. She could not abandon him. Her hand slid along the cold stone wall, searching for a light, a latch, anything. Her fingers brushed against a small, iron ring. A handle. She pulled. A sconce holder. With a groan of ancient metal, a single, flickering torch ignited, casting a weak, dancing light down a steep flight of stone steps. She did not go down. She turned and pressed her ear against the wood of the secret door. She could hear the sounds of the fight clearly now. Grunts of effort, the sickening thud of fists on flesh, the sharp crack of breaking bone. She heard Caspian's voice, not speaking, but roaring, a sound that was not human, an animalistic snarl of pure rage that made the wall vibrate. She had to do something. But what? She was a waitress. She had no skills, no strength. But she had listened. For 6 weeks, she had done nothing but listen. She knew him. She knew his loneliness, his grief. She knew his world was one of power and violence, but his heart remembered a garden. An idea sparked in her mind, born of desperation and a crazy, illogical hope. The ballroom. The portraits. The music room. He was a creature of history, of memory. This house was his anchor, his fortress, not just physically, but emotionally. She ran. Barefoot and terrified, she fled down the hallway, away from the sounds of violence. She threw open the double doors to the grand ballroom. The vast, empty space was filled with moonlight pouring through the tall, arched windows. And on the walls, surrounding the room, were the portraits of his ancestors. Generations of pale, dark-eyed vampires, their solemn faces judging her from behind layers of varnish and time. She remembered a story he'd told her, a fragment prompted by a memory she'd shared of a family reunion. He had spoken of his line, of the weight of their legacy, the burden of their name. They are always watching, he had said, and she'd thought he was being metaphorical. Now, she wasn't so sure. Help him, she shouted into the empty room, her voice echoing in the stillness. His your blood. He is the king. Help him. The painted eyes stared back, impassive. Nothing happened. A fool's hope. Of course. They were just paintings. She heard a crash from the foyer, the sound of a body being thrown against a wall. A cry of pain, and this time, it was Caspian's. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. She ran from the ballroom and into the adjacent music room. The grand piano stood in the center of the room like a sarcophagus. What was she thinking? This was insane. But she had to try. She threw back the lid and slammed her hands down on the keys. A horrible, discordant crash of notes shattered the silence. She wasn't a musician. She didn't know how to play. But she remembered another fragment. He'd told her once that his mother used to play. A simple melody. A lullaby. He had hummed a few bars, his voice a low, melancholic whisper. She tried to find the notes, her fingers fumbling on the keys. Plink. Plonk. It was a child's clumsy attempt. Useless. Then she saw it. On the wall above the piano, there was a single, small portrait she hadn't noticed before. It was not of a stern-faced lord, but of a woman. She had dark, kind eyes and a gentle smile. Her hair was bound up in an old style, and around her neck was a simple chain. She was beautiful. And in her eyes, Ilara saw Caspian. It was his mother. Please, Ilara whispered to the painting, tears streaming down her face. He remembers you. He remembers the roses. Please, help him. And then, from the piano, a single, perfect note rang out. Clear and pure. Ilara hadn't touched the key. Another note followed, and then another, weaving together into a simple, heartbreakingly sad melody. The lullaby. The piano was playing by itself. The music swelled, pouring out of the room, filling the house. It was a sound of profound love and profound sorrow, a melody of memory itself. It was the house, waking up. The house, remembering its mistress. The house, coming to the aid of its master. The sounds of the fight in the foyer changed. The grunts and snarls of the intruders were replaced by shrieks of terror. Ilara heard a man scream, "What is this?" "The shadows, they're moving." She ran back into the hall and peered around the corner. The foyer was a maelstrom of chaos. The silvery light that always seemed to emanate from the stone was now brighter, swirling. The shadows in the corners were no longer static, they writhed and coiled like living things, reaching out with long, inky tendrils. The portraits in the hall, their eyes now seemed to glow with a faint, malevolent light. Two of the intruders were swatting at the air, screaming as the shadows wrapped around their limbs. A third was on his knees, staring in horror as the marble floor beneath him seemed to ripple like dark water. Caspian stood in the center of it all. He was bleeding from a cut on his temple, his shirt torn. But he was no longer just fighting with his fists. He was conducting the house's power, his hands moving in the air as if pulling on invisible strings. The fourth intruder, a large, brutish man, charged him with a silver knife. Before he could reach him, a shadow detached itself from the wall and slammed into him, throwing him back like a rag doll. The lullaby from the music room reached its crescendo, a final, sorrowful chord that hung in the air like a sigh. And then, silence. The four intruders lay on the floor, unconscious or dead. The shadows receded into the corners. The light from the stone dimmed to its usual soft glow. The house was still once more. Caspian stood panting in the center of the carnage, his chest rising and falling. He slowly turned his head and looked down the hall at her. His eyes were wide, filled with a mixture of fury, relief, and utter, soul-shaking astonishment. He had felt the house respond, had heard the music. He knew it was her. She had not run. She had not hidden. She, a mortal waitress with nothing but stories and a desperate hope, had woken the heart of his home and saved him. The bargain was broken, rewritten. She was no longer just the keeper of his memories. She was a part of his fortress. And in the quiet aftermath of the battle, he looked at her not as a king looks at a subject, or a predator at its charge, but as an equal, his awe and gratitude a silent, staggering confession in the ruins of his hall. The aftermath of the battle was a strange, suspended silence. Caspian dealt with the bodies of the intruders with a chilling, silent efficiency, making them vanish from the foyer as if they had never been. He moved with a weary grace, the cuts and bruises he'd sustained already beginning to fade, his supernatural healing a quiet, unsettling miracle. Ilara stood by the doorway of the music room, her hand resting on the now silent piano, her body trembling with the last vestiges of adrenaline and fear. When he was finished, the grand foyer was immaculate once more, the marble floors gleaming, showing no sign of the violence that had occurred. Only the faint, coppery scent of blood lingered in the air, a ghost of the battle. Caspian walked toward her, his steps slow, deliberate. He stopped a few feet away, his dark eyes searching her face. The awe she had seen in his gaze moments before was still there, now tempered with a deep, consuming worry. "You are not hurt," he said. It was a statement, but his voice was tight with the fear that it might not be true. She shook her head, unable to speak. "You should have run," he whispered, his voice raw. "You would have died," she whispered back, and the truth of it hung between them, stark and undeniable. Without the intervention of the house, of his mother's memory, he would have been overwhelmed. He closed his eyes for a moment, a flicker of pain crossing his features. "The risk," he began, but he couldn't finish. The risk to her, taken on his behalf, was a weight he could not bear to articulate. He had constructed this entire arrangement to keep her safe, to keep his world from touching hers, and she had just dived headfirst into the very heart of his darkness to save him. He looked around the hall, at the portraits, at the stones, as if seeing his home for the first time. "I did not know," he murmured. After she was gone, the house, it slept. It has not answered a call in centuries. He looked back at Ilara, his gaze intense. "It answered you." "I just asked," she said, feeling foolish. "I told her you remembered the roses." A look of profound, heartbreaking sorrow passed over Caspian's face. He took the final step that separated them, and gently, hesitantly, he reached out and touched her cheek. His fingers were cool, but his touch was electric, a jolt of impossible connection. "No one has ever fought for me," he said, his voice thick with the weight of 1,000 lonely years. "I am the one who fights. I am the shield." I am the king. You were the boy in the garden first, she replied softly. His thumb brushed against her skin, a feather-light caress. In his eyes, she saw the walls of his fortress crumbling, the centuries of solitude receding, leaving behind only the raw, vulnerable man beneath the crown. He had wanted her memories to feel human again, but in that moment, in her defiant, courageous act, she had given him back something far more vital, a reason to be. The bargain was irrevocably altered. It was no longer about safety for stories, a simple, if bizarre, transaction. It had become a partnership, an alliance of two lonely souls who had found in each other a reason to fight the encroaching darkness. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in the house shifted. The threat from Werewolves and his allies was not gone. In fact, Caspian knew it would be worse now. They had seen a glimpse of the manor's true power, and they had seen Ilara's role in it. She was no longer a weakness, she was an unknown, a variable they could not account for, which made her even more dangerous in their eyes. But within the walls, the oppressive tension was replaced by a new, quiet intimacy. Caspian no longer disappeared for hours on end. He stayed. He worked in the library, poring over ancient maps and texts, but he did so where she could see him. She would sit in her armchair, reading one of the thousands of books, and the comfortable silence between them was a conversation in itself. Their nightly ritual continued, but it was different now. She still told him her stories, but he began to share more of his own, offering them up not as historical footnotes, but as pieces of himself. He told her of Rome in its glory, not of the emperors and battles, but of the taste of wine from a specific vineyard that no longer existed, and the sound of a poet declaiming his verses in a crowded forum. He told her of Renaissance Florence, of watching a young Michelangelo carve his David, of feeling the artist's divine frustration and ambition as if it were his own. He was giving her his memories, repaying his debt. One evening, after she had told him a funny, self-deprecating story about a terrible first date, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I was married once." The words dropped into the quiet room with the weight of stones. Ilara held her breath, waiting. Her name was Isolde, he said, his eyes fixed on the fire. It was a long time ago. An arrangement, for political power. I did not expect to care for her. But she was fierce, and clever, and she was not afraid of me. She saw the man, not the monster. He paused. She was mortal. It was a brief, bright flame in a very long night. He did not tell her how he lost her. He did not have to. Ilara could feel the cold, permanent ache of it in his voice. She had seen the scar, now she knew its name. The price he had asked for was not what she expected. He had asked for her memories, her small, human stories. But what he had truly been asking for was a reflection. A mirror to show him the man he had once been, the humanity he feared he had lost forever. And in the process of giving him that gift, she had found her own reflection in his ancient, lonely eyes. She saw not a waitress, not a victim, but a woman of strength and courage, a woman who could wake a sleeping house and stand beside a king. The war outside was not over. Werewolves would regroup. His enemies would plot. The world was still a dangerous place. But inside the walls of the ancient house, something new had been forged. It was not a contract. It was not a romance, not yet. It was something quieter, deeper, and more resilient. A bond built of shared stories and mutual salvation. One night, they sat by the fire, the ritual of storytelling complete. A comfortable silence enveloped them. Ilara looked at Caspian, at the way the firelight softened the aristocratic severity of his face, at the quiet peace that had settled in his eyes, a peace she had helped put there. "Caspian," she said. "The price. Have I paid it?" He turned to look at her, a small, genuine smile touching his lips. It transformed his face, chasing away the last of the ancient shadows. "No," he said softly. The price was only the beginning. It was the key to a door. He reached across the small space between them, his hand hovering over hers for a moment before he gently took it. His skin was still cool, but there was a warmth in his grip that came from within. "This," he said, his gaze holding hers, his voice resonating with a truth that was centuries in the making. "This is the arrangement now." He did not need her memories anymore. He was making new ones. With her. And in the quiet warmth of the library, surrounded by the stories of the world, Ilara knew she was finally, truly, safe. She was home.